think the only context change with this is that now we're not just looking at one version of a bill. With these two questions, we're looking at the Senate version as well as the House version.
That tracks. Okay, and I just grabbed those from the minutes as well. Thanks for that. All in the realm of finance. Yeah. Well, this is like very pertinent to my role off the commission right now too, as we head into Senate finance and are trying to, you know, as I mentioned, the commission kind of like bring the discussion back to how this plays out in the kind of like tax finance space. But I know that's only one of the two crucial finance spaces that, you know, under consideration here.
Right.
Like kind of high on my mind, more related to question number 4, I guess, is it is like the underrepresented or underserved communities. Something that's been interesting for me is this the new design for income sensitivity that's being considered in the Gov's original recommendation and then was even bolstered in the House plan. Curious to engage like on the Senate side about what's the vision and direction there in advance of a conference committee where the House and Senate members will be together, because this homestead exemption framework compared to the current property tax credit framework really kind of like redistribute some of that income sensitivity property tax support to folks that are in lower value homes for the first time. Like kind of like one of the, I think, not so well understood and kind of counterintuitive pieces of our current income sensitivity system is that folks that are in really valuable homes get the most benefit from our current income sensitivity system. And that's like shouldered by all of us taxpayers within the property tax system. You know, everyone pays a little more to support our income sensitivity, but it really like the program design is to make up the difference between what you'd pay on the full value of your property versus what you'd pay as a percentage of your income. So because of that, a lot of the benefit goes to people in really high value homes. And these new policy designs, like kind of by definition, target support to folks that are in lower value homes or make sure those folks aren't excluded from an income sensitivity program. And that's the part of this work that's felt really exciting for me, like where I sat at the tax department, an opportunity to kind of address some of that, you know, at times misalignment between the folks that need help and the folks that could get property tax relief. So I feel like it's like a couple steps beyond where we've been, you know, engaging as a commission, which is much more on the education side of the house, but that's
right. And I feel like that's the part that they're going to start discussing like coming up, not really as much. They haven't really had a lot of discussion about it. And it's interesting too, because if you think about that, it's almost like the way it's set up now is incentivizing, even if you have a lower income, incentivizing you to own a home that is of high value. You're going to get more in credit and help with your tax bill than someone who, you know, is being modest about, hey, this is my income level, I'm going to own this home. And, you know, I mean, not everybody's in that situation because maybe they inherited the house. So, you know, who knows?
Totally.
Who knows what the situation is. But in some cases, I think people could kind of play that game of like, well, if my house is worth double, I'm going to get double the credit in the tax credit, regardless of where my income really lies. So that's interesting.
Right. And of those things, you know, folks, especially, there are plenty of mechanisms that are quite legal to, you know, adjust your income. So, you know, if you're a person that has a high value house and maybe has other, you know, unearned sources of income that you can, you know, manipulate to kind of like maintain a low enough income to continue to get a property tax credit in Vermont, when, you know, arguably there might still be, you might have ability to pay for a higher tax burden than what the state's, you know, leaving you with because of that. So there's a lot of
right. There's like a mismatch. Whereas if it's a person who just has one job and then it comes in on a W-2, there's no way to manipulate that. You know, that's just, it is what it is. That's what your income is. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like, yeah. So I'm just speaking transparently. That's what's on my mind today as I think about the numbers and narratives. Like, excited to get that narrative, out in front of another committee, because of the implementation timeline, like how in advance we're working towards all of this. Legislators aren't necessarily on the hook to figure out all these policy details this session. The Senate's kind of taken more of a strategy, as we've been discussing, of like, let's get these, big pillars in place and do a lot of the policy making next session once we know the districts. And there is some value to that, especially when it comes to the homestead exemption, like knowing what the districts are, because you could really like paint you can do much more exact tax modeling of like, how will a property owner, in Berry City today, fare compared to current law. Once we know more of these policy levers that are in flux, you could really do cleaner modeling of what a homestead exemption, like with different parameters, like ones that look more like the houses, ones that look more like the governors, what it would mean to individuals
Right.
who are, hoping to understand that. So that's a bit of a tension now, like wanting to have this all buttoned up as like a full package that, legislators can talk about in the off season, and, we can, that the governor can consider as a package at the end of this session. But at the same time, there's like some merits of waiting till we have some of these, policy levers set so we can have numbers that make sense. Am I static?
Let's see. They are saying, I don't know. I mean, I remember from our last meeting, we were talking about, in context of question number 3, what did we feel like we needed for data? And I don't really feel like that's changed, like from what our opinion was from that last meeting. The only thing that's really changed is that now there's a slightly different bill on the table.
Yeah.
They were talking about modeling on the existing state, both present and future state would be helpful. And I feel like now that the House bill is, been completely changed and it's different, and there's kind of a new formula there again, I think we still need the same type of data modeled out. But like you said, it's a little hard to say what the future state would be. I guess you just assume some range of scale, even though they kind of took out like the district size in that bill, to assume some kind of scale to be able to say this is the potential future state and what that scale is based on, because you don't know the district lines yet. So you can't just say all these districts are going to be one district. So how they would model the future state would be challenging because those district lines are not drawn.
Exactly. And I think, to be relevant to this session, I think we'll just have to, and we were kind of meeting about this morning before the commission, we'll just have to pick a, kind of sandbox to imagine. And the 11 SBA district seems to be like, something maybe around the scale that we might land at next session. So that's looking like a strategy just like purely for modeling current law versus future state.
I think it would be important because I think, I just looked at the chart that I saw that came around, and it was from this most recent bill, and with, the foundation formula incorporated by district as it exists, and then within each county. And then you're kind of seeing like, and it's based on this fiscal year's, count of students and weighting with the new weights. And like, it's pretty easy to see that if you just pick a particular school district out of the pile, some are, going to see more revenue and some would see, in that scenario. But then when you look at their whole county, it's an average percent increase or decrease amongst the entire. But it's still interesting to see like the disparity between some districts within the same county, like a huge jump between one and another, showing that maybe that district, has had opportunity to have more funding available to them for quite some time and the others have not, and they might be literally right next door to each other. And how or why that is, I don't necessarily know, because I don't know, there's probably all kinds of factors involved there, but it's interesting to see though, and some of them do kind of scare me, because I think one of the other members mentioned something about a couple of those districts are at scale already, what we would call scale if we were to think about the number of students and in their population, and they're already technically running at scale, and yet now they would receive less funding if they were standalone by themselves in that model, which is a little scary, because I don't know how they would achieve that without cutting programming for kids. And yet they're already at the scale. And so are they really going to be one of those districts that's going to merge with another district if they're already large enough?
Yeah, and just like, understanding like what's possible in terms of like a real apples to apples comparison there, where, we are acknowledging they will be part of a bigger district with, even if they're at scale now, they'll be, part of like even greater shared efficiencies, or maybe sharing some of their efficiencies with the rest of their
I think that would be the only thing they'd be able to do to save that funding, right? Like, that's the only thing they would be able to, is they'd have to partner with someone, even if they're already at scale on something, on some level, in order to be able to achieve that without drastically reducing what they are offering to students themselves. And some of it's just a little surprising to see some of the districts that actually are in that situation. But so I think I'm also curious about, when we think about the weights, I'm curious about just kind of a snapshot bullet list of how are we coming up with the weights that we're applying for particular groups of students? Like, what is it based on? Because I've seen like 10 different models where weights are changing, and they're all different from what we use today. We have weighting now, but it's all weighting based on the ADM, the average daily membership of student enrollment, right? So now they're doing it differently because it's a foundation formula, but it's still like, where are the weights coming from? What are we basing that on?
And this is like speaking out of my expertise for sure, but I do know that AOE in their evidence-based and enhanced evidence-based model have been, and also on the House side, like all three of those iterations had like, very data-driven foundation to how each of those weights were calculated. On the Senate Ed side, I know that their process was a little different, of like, wanting to match current law spending as a starting place, and then kind of like iterating the weights down from that like overall spending picture, which is so like less rooted in like Dr. Colby's work, or the Pikus report with Vermont changes. So that hasn't been my side of the house, but I know that there's a ton of testimony documents there that I think could get exactly what you needed. Like, I'm even imagining seeing some of them last week. That'd be good to bring back to this group.
Yeah, so information about where the weights come from. And I don't think it's just for our knowledge. I think it's like whatever we're reporting back out to the general public, even, a lot of people are seeing different numbers and they're like, where are these coming from? I think that's important, just so that people can understand. So information about the weights, information about modeling, like we said, both present and future state, but we'd have to kind of make a guess at what future state is.
Yeah, or I don't even want to say make a guess, but like
just pick something.
Pick a parameter.
Right. And just really say, this is just an example. We're not saying these should be the boundaries, kind of thing. Because I think too many people are cherry picking districts off of that, that list I saw too. And be easy enough for me to do that in my tiny little district, because mine all by itself would be in a really bad situation if that was to happen. But I also realize that we can easily partner with the other districts that are right in our close proximity. Middlebury, Mount Abraham, Lincoln, all of those in Addison County. So I think there's opportunity there to save funds and to share. I think the biggest opportunity is what you can offer to kids, because some of the things that we can offer in our high school, for instance, Bristol doesn't, and vice versa. So I think that's kind of getting on like question number 4 is it's trying to enhance the services by sharing, not just financially, but for students to be able to access things that they can't access in your own community. And it talks about the underrepresented, and we were thinking more along the lines of like who has money and who doesn't as far as their property taxes. But I think this is also talking about where these weights are being applied, right? Like, so for the students who have disabilities or whatever, making sure that those weights that are being applied actually adequately sustains the needs. And I think how they decide, that's where weights get a little confusing to me, because let's imagine you have a district with 300 students that are with disabilities. If you just give a weight that is kind of all encompassing, does that drive your districts to diagnose or designate students with disabilities at a higher rate? Not that anybody purposely wants to do something like that. That doesn't make sense. But what I'm saying is there's always a fine line between a student that needs a 504 plan and a student that needs an IEP. And so if you're basing weights in a district on they have an IEP, they don't have an IEP, I have a little bit of concern about people overqualifying the number of students that meet those criteria.
Interesting.
If you think, the old foundation formula for special education did that. It was like, it made it so that if you could designate them as needing an IEP, then they're on the list and you get a certain amount of revenue for that number of students. And it could be the same way in the weighting. It's just too easy for people to, kind of push the evals on those and make them so that they're one little click over from a 504 plan to an IEP, and then they're counted in the weighting for special education. So it's unfortunate that is kind of how it happens, but I think we want to make sure there's not any incentive to kind of overdiagnose the needs, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, no, totally. And I can't even remember now if the Senate version is managing special ed through weight or a categorical.
It looks like they're doing it through categorical, to me, in the Senate version, because it said that it's not including special education. So I would assume that they're leaving it under categoricals. Maybe it spells it right out here in this comparison. I think it might.
And I found the testimony document about what goes into the weights underlying the enhanced EB model, which was the one that AOE proposed to kind of match Senate Education's like desired spending level, but with by getting there by, kind of like bolstering the evidence-based weights that they had proposed initially, rather than getting there kind of by backing out weights from an overall spend. But I see our chat is turned off, so I will have to send it to you in a different mechanism here. But again, I'm like, I don't know, you got stuck with like the one commission member who is not well versed in, education budgets. Sorry, I can't be more helpful than that.
That's okay.
Wrong side of the house.
Just kind of looking through that comparison, trying to see if it actually outlines that. I'm not finding it super fast here. Prohibition.
Yeah. And I'll just say it's Secretary Saunders' testimony from May 1st on their committee page, which maybe I'll just shoot you an email.
Okay.
For leisure reading later.
It talks about the state special education delivery model, but it doesn't change any of the language there.
Yeah, that might end up being in the realm of like policy decisions on hold for next session.
Yeah, it might be.
Which is, yeah, a challenging space for our, work of evaluating the.
Oh, here it is. I see on the scenario that they did with those different districts, it actually says that it consists of H454 weights constrained to the FY25 education payment with pupil grade weights and eliminated sparsity due to data constraints. And then it says it does not include special education or other categorical aid. So that was the analysis. It was done by JFO on 4/29/25.
Right. That's the district by district table.
Yeah. Yeah.
Spending changes. Yeah. Yeah. That was interesting. But it is interesting to like, keep having these like snippets of like the whole spend.
Right. And it just basically is kind of comparing like what is their long-term weighted ADM based on that information. And then what would their estimated education base opportunity payment be with that foundation formula? And how much is that increasing or decreasing percentage wise compared to what it actually was for the same fiscal year? And then it's sorted by county. Which I think this is useful. I mean, something like this is kind of useful in that manner of like comparing what does it really look like for the future state. I mean, this is based on current state, but you can imagine that within some reasonability, some of those counties might end up being a district, right? So
interesting.
You almost can kind of see what that would look like for the whole county if you look at those whole county percentages, positive or negative. But like you said, there's so much that doesn't factor into this. If they're not factoring in special education, if they're not, then that's completely, it's kind of skewing it. There's no perfect way to pull data to help us, like all make the perfect decision, unfortunately.
Yeah. And you mentioned those Act 127 incentive rates, and that alone has been like, kind of stymieing the modeling. Like, do we have to do an apples to apples comparison? Do we need to strip out those incentive rates to like, really look at the current structure versus a future structure to see rate changes? Or it's just a lot of layers.
Right.
Layers here.
So how long do we have before we got to go back and report to our people about what we talked about?
I think she said 35, so we have to have some chunk of time. Yeah, but report back. That's a good thing to think about here.
Like here we are just talking and we're not writing anything down.
I know. Okay. Okay.
Consolidate our thoughts.
I love that plan. Well, like, I mean, from my limited, educational background, but like the, watching what was happening in Senate education over the last couple of weeks, like, yeah, I like it's too bad that our Senate member hasn't been in the meetings to kind of like, lend some narrative there. But, I kind of like lost the foundation formula kind of like loses some of its power and value to me when the weights in the base don't have like clear assumptions underlying them. Like that's kind of how I got used to thinking about the foundation formula. Being in the room as AOE did the hard work of constructing the initial one, and then like hearing all the thought that went into the house's version, which had a different starting place, but similarly, like just like a lot of like whys. What was packed into the foundation. There's a lot of like why behind it. And
so maybe that's part of for number 3 is like looking at numbers and narratives. When you look at the different iterations of foundation formula, some kind of analysis comparing them and also explaining what the thought process is behind the decisions of making them different, right? Like, so not just that they're different, but like, why are they different? What is the thought process that made them decide that part of that foundation formula wasn't the best and this one would be better, like, because I haven't seen any kind of comparison between them. They're just comparing the numbers that it ends up with. But as far as deciding on the weights and deciding the factors that all go in, and are we including special education? Are we not including special education? Kind of how that all plays in together hasn't been analyzed and kind of clearly pointed out why people think it should be different.
Like a plain language summary of the why for each of them, I think would be pretty handy. And to her credit, Secretary Saunders, I think tried to give us that at the beginning of the call. Right. But I think having something like laid out and digestible, that's like, this is the version that focuses on spending the same amount as a transition mechanism to an evidence-based one. I guess, we mentioned that, but that was like a big part of the House's strategy, is like spending a lot of time on a foundation formula that's meant to transition the system to foundation formula world with, a contingent date for transitioning again to a second evidence-based formula. So I think that's important. Like, there was so much detailed work in that first, like, attention to that first transition one, and kind of like saving the policy decisions for an eventual evidence-based one till that contingent effective date. So that's, I think, like an important part of the narrative behind the numbers that I even lose track of, just because I spend so much time on that foundation formula. That's not even like the end all be all. That would just be a transition step. So, like kind of some of those. I think in comparing those, it would be valuable for the public and also stakeholders just to kind of have a zoomed out view of the rationale of each of these.
And then we also agreed that the data that still would be helpful is a little more detailed than just like district by district using current numbers, but more of like a future state. What do they envision? Like you said, they'd have to just pick a number of districts and, pretend they're drawing lines just to give an example of what it would look like. Because the alternative is every single district is going to be out there just trying to do this on their own, in their own way, and more focused on just their current their current district, which can scare people away. And I think what you were talking about with question 4, the benefits and burdens, other than the fact that the whole proposed policy seeks to enhance services by being able to share services for students, right? Like that's the whole idea. So that makes perfect sense. But even you were taking it further to talk about like the tax and the credit that people are seeing on their, changing that whole policy, which isn't really being talked about yet. It's kind of coming soon. I think that that's important to kind of throw in there, just because that's your area of expertise, and
Yeah.
you know, it's like, that's something to be excited about that doesn't really necessarily affect any of these other topics.
Yeah, it's almost like an additional, ability to pay layer that gets layered on top of all this, but becomes, pretty crucial when we're talking about, the narrative behind the numbers, like what, like
Well, and
our,
illustrating where the money comes from, and that sometimes, and trying to make it so that those who can pay and have the ability to pay are really the ones who end up paying the higher amount, versus just that they found a gray area or a loophole to be able to save money on their own side of things. Anytime you can eliminate the gray area to make it more equitable.
right. Yeah, I liked how you framed that, like the question of like ability to pay. Like
Yeah, so like you were talking about, some people have the
comparison.
ability, but that's because then nobody really knows it because it's not on paper, right? It's not being reported anywhere. Well, it's reported somewhere, someone knows that they're making that money, but it's not being reported in such a way that the government would have an understanding of what their real true income is.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
their ability to pay. Which is like a bigger issue than we can solve than ed reform. But I do, like kind of getting, it's like the kind of like shared direction. The points of agreement are it's neat to me that like the seems like good tax policy has been kind of like shared tenets throughout these, and that the foundation formula alone, even though it doesn't feel like a tax policy thing, completely changes the game of like a really complex and somewhat unfair system. There's like aspects that are unfair about a system today that's like based on equity, and that even districts that like really feel like they can't spend $1 more on education and vote that way end up shouldering decisions of the whole state, and then have missed the opportunity to fund their own schools in the meantime. It's just like the complexity and
Right. And there again, though, sometimes that's just the voting community in that area that might be unwilling to pay, a higher tax rate. That doesn't mean they can't, or they're not capable, or that they want any less services in their schools. But, how they're making their decision is not necessarily based on any of those things. They're just wanting to see their tax rate be lower. I mean, there's districts that perpetually never pass their budget, and they are not high spending schools. So,
just like the merits of taking that responsibility, I guess, off of that level feels that like micro level of governance, when it's almost like a false sense of control, when ultimately like the rate you're going to be paying is so impacted by everyone else.
Yeah, I have community members that will ask sometimes, like, well, what is my tax dollar actually paying for as well? Your tax dollar is actually paying for the whole state. Sorry, but I think it's really not specific to your town or your school. And in some cases, some of our towns don't even have a school in them. They're a town, but they have their students are all going to a school that's close by. It's interesting how many people don't really understand the system. And I'm not sure actually with a foundation formula whether they really will either. I think it might be easier for us all to explain in the end. But I don't know that everyone is going to get super involved in trying to fully understand.
Yeah. But what's nice about that is that kids will get their established, pool of money, regardless of if there is like accurate understanding or not. Which like we always hope for transparency, clear, understanding, everything like that. But I don't know, just feels a little safer for students when, their outcomes are not dependent on people wrapping their heads around like a painfully complex, very unique tax mechanism.
And the only thing I think I've heard a couple people bring this up, and this is kind of off topic according to the questions that we have here, but I think about, well, not really though, if you're talking about, students in underserved populations, but if you are a larger district and you're receiving a certain amount of money, pretty much just based on this is the student population you have, this is the number of kids you have, this is the weights, here's your foundation formula dollar amount. In theory, yes, every student is getting the same amount of money. But how do you put parameters in place on the school districts to report back on outcomes in such a way that they are proving that they have spent those funds equitably on the students that need the funding? Does that make sense? So like,
Right.
how
Totally.
how
Yeah.
do you follow that with like an outcomes report that actually basically holds the school districts, the newly formed school districts, accountable? Because what I'd hate to see is, if you've got a school district that's newly formed and maybe they're made up of 5 other districts in which 2 have always been notoriously underserved. How are you going to know that that doesn't continue?
So important for number 4. Yeah,
and I didn't write any of that down.
Oh, go ahead.
I didn't write that down.
I'm writing it down. And
I'm talking, but I'm not writing.
Yeah, okay. Well, how about, for a report back, I'm happy to
just read your notes. Okay.
Yeah,
and then I can just like
okay, invite you to season. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and then like, is that accountability? Like, is the expectation that gets traced back to the, school that generated, most of those weights? Is the expectation that gets traced back to the student within the school that weight is like attached to,
Right. Or is it even not student necessarily, but like you look at the school itself and say, this has always, this entire school's been underserved, right? Like for all these years. And now are they still underserved? Are they still receiving less than their share of the funding? And I think probably the way you try to stop that from happening is by making sure that when you set up those newly formed districts, that each population is represented somehow on that new board, right? So like the new district board, make sure that the representation is equal in some fashion so that there isn't a chance right from the beginning that they're going to continue to be underserved in that newly formed district. But yeah, I think it can trickle all the way down to the individual student, but it can also be just traditionally that whole school or that whole town has been underserved.
Right. And I have these same, like, I worry about these same concerns playing out in, getting back to the tax base, and the like potential allowance for districts to be spending above the education opportunity payment. If those decisions are being made at this new big district level, even if it's for like a limited percentage of, budget, but like, if like some of the previous iterations have contemplated like 10% of your foundation formula, which is like a pretty hefty amount. If those, even if it's like strategic priorities only that extra spending is allowed for, like, how to make sure that there's some, it just seems like a really complicated thing to make sure that like the tax rate impact is certainly going to be felt by everyone within that district, but is like the result of whatever that supplemental spending is for going to be felt by everyone in the district. So that's like a little tricky.
Right. I mean, it happens now, right? It happens now because we have a particular school district, and because they're a consolidated school district, and let's say they have 5 schools, if they put out for a bond and they get the school district to be, it gets approved and they put the money into, let's say that bond is for one particular building, one of the 5. The whole district and the taxpayers are paying for that one building. and their students may never attend that building because it's not the high school, it's an elementary school. And so, it's kind of like the same thing. Now you're going to have a much larger district when they make decisions about doing something and spending funds. How do you make sure that they are evenly distributing the funding to all of the schools, all of the towns, all of the students? I think it becomes more challenging because you're talking about a larger regional area with more school buildings in it and more diversity in the towns that contribute to it.
Right.
So I think I don't know what kind of mechanism they could instill, but it could be some kind of like after each year, something to do with how you report back. And putting some criteria on how the school districts are going to report back on outcomes and how they use the money. I know that currently we all file like a statistical report. If there could be something incorporated into that process that would force districts to have to report back on how they equitably distributed the funds.
And is it even like a reasonable, is like equity the reasonable ask for that? Or is it is that even realistic, I guess? I'm having trouble like imagining an example of like a district saying, we need to raise a little bit more than our EOP because of like the strategic thing we want to do. I guess it would have to be a strategic thing that they want to execute across all their schools. It's not like
it's not just like, oh, our towns are willing to pay it, so we're just going to do this and we're going to have more money for our district. That's not, I don't think that's the criteria or the goal. I think it's more like we have, and it might even be something like we have to fix one of our buildings. It might be something specific project wise that they are asking their taxpayers to increase their rate because we are going to do this. And so in that way, that extra money that's voted in, I think it would be pretty easily reportable back on because you're going to have to be able to document and prove what you spent that on. But I think just as a general rule of thumb, like the base education amount that you're going to get for your newly formed district, being able to document that you spent it equitably on all of the schools in your newly formed district is going to be challenging because nobody records things at each building level necessarily. You don't record your costs that way.
Right. Yeah, and is something I mean, you're probably well aware from where you said that this must be something that happens even within smaller districts today, but is it okay to have a strategic priority that will really only, if it's like a construction, something that would impact one school or one area of your district?
I think it is if you are very transparent about the reason and, if you're also able to justify that, well, if that particular location was underserved for a certain period of time and now they need to be fixed, right? Like they need the extra and the rest of you have had it all along, then that is a justifiable reason to increase something specifically for that particular school or whatever. And as long as your voters approve it, right? Because they're going to have to, voters would have to say yes. And all voters would have, all the communities would have to be like, yes, we are willing to put this into that particular project. Then they go into it knowing that it's on one particular topic or building or school. And I think that's okay because the theory, it's just that, being able to document and justify that you actually have the proof and documentation showing that that is why you're going to put more money into your budget. I just hope there is restrictions on not, like you said, I'm concerned about the whole Brigham idea and that there will be towns and communities that would vote in a higher percentage rate regardless, if they would be willing, if they, basically wanted to go into their particular schools. And that's something we have to avoid. So I think it has to be project-based. It has to be specific and project-based.
Project-based, but then the transparency piece, that kind of careful accounting, helping folks within the district kind of keep tabs on
Right.
if an area of the district starts feeling underserved by those supplemental,
Right.
programs.
Right. And you would want that anyway, because your district, your board, if you got it approved, you would want to be able to, if another, one particular school came forward and said, hey, wait, we voted this in and we didn't end up with any of that money. You'd want to have the documentation that you were very transparent about it, that you said it was all going to go to this project.
Right.
When it was voted, you'd want to be able to prove that. So you kind of want to be able to cover yourself in that situation too. But I think there's got to be a way that they can, after the fact, after each fiscal year ends, if there's situations like that they require reporting back from the districts. That basically, then you said, can you ever really get equity? Well, I think the difference is you can't get, what do they call it? Equality. You can't get equality, but can you get equity? Because equity is more based on what does that population need, right? Whereas equality would mean everyone gets the same exact dollar amount. And that's not necessarily the case. Not everyone needs the same exact dollar amount. Some organizations have different needs. And it's going to cost different amounts of money. So it's not dollar for dollar. It's are you adequately serving the needs with the money you've been given?
Is it more of like now that you've, bringing up the distinction between those two terms, like when we go back to the previous example of like accountability of spending relative to the weights that are generating the spending.
And I think that's where it is. If you can make sure that if you make sure the weights are correct, then that's how you would know, right? Like, okay, that particular school has a huge population of ELL students or whatever the case may be. Then you could justify why more of the money went to that location, right? Because the weights defend the reason why more money needed to be spent for the needs. So yeah, it's basically trying to keep true to the amount of spending with those weights considered.
Ladies, are we ready to hop back over to the main meeting?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, I'm gonna do my best, Elizabeth, and you're gonna help.
If I hear something, I'll chime in.
Okay, great.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks.